If I can get an approval of the agenda.
Moved.
Mark. Charles, okay. Declarations of conflict of interest.
Mine continue to persist.
Mine continue to persist.
Mine's no more.
All right. What else? Okay, and approval of the previous minutes. Again, well, I would just note that they're back to being quite lengthy minutes, and if we can, we'd move more towards a tightened version as opposed to a play-by-play.
Okay. Yeah, it was tricky just given the Q&A nature
Yeah.
of the last one, but yeah, I'll figure it out for the next one.
I would agree.
Okay.
Maybe we could just start to capture decisions, actions, and issues, and nothing more.
It's
Because it's recorded.
It's fine by me.
Well, can I get approval of the minutes we do? Thank you. I'm going to be brief with the chair's remarks, just to welcome everyone again and express sincere gratitude to Charles, to his entire committee, to Vance for, I think, the really exceptional work that was done on the report that was released this week. I thought it did a really good job of capturing the views. There are people who have some positive things to say, unquestionably, about some of the innovations. There are people who have some concerns, people who want to see more information, and I thought the report did a really nice job of doing that, and I think is a valuable contributor to the contribution to this process, and I think helps demonstrate the value that this panel can have. So thank you, because I know there was an enormous amount of work that took place from the entire writing committee, and I know Vance did a really strong job helping to pull all that together. So thank you all. We are joined today by the new CEO of Waterfront Toronto. I want to introduce George Segarek and invite you to say hello and introduce yourself.
That's great, Michael. So actually, let me start, Michael, by echoing your thank you to the panel and to the group that put the panel report out. That's an important piece for us and for Sidewalk to look at in terms of moving forward, but also for our partners. And I mentioned to Christine, it was really important for us to start to decipher which of these comments is really for Sidewalk to consider, which of the comments are for Waterfront, which are comments for our government partners in terms of what their future considerations for legislation or other ideas. So we'll continue to work with the panel around some of that discussion. I really do appreciate, though, the foundational piece that you've now put in front of the public and in front of Sidewalk for consideration. The other issue, though, that I've raised with our team is to continue to look at whatever we're asking for and advising from the panel's advice to us, I guess, is also for consideration of if it's not Sidewalk and it's another partner, small or even beyond this project, Canadian companies that may be doing similar types of collection of information, etc. We need to be thoughtful about what we're asking. So it's not what we're asking just of Sidewalk, it's what we're asking of anybody participating in these type of activities going forward. So just that type of foundational piece, if you guys keep that in mind as you give us advice, that would be extremely helpful, because that's one of the things that the lens that I put on the information as I look at it. But it's really good. I think it's a good foundational piece. I think you made it very clear. These are comments, not necessarily the final recommendations of the panel, et cetera. And I think that's important. That I think got lost a little bit by some of the media attention. I think people need to understand that, but I think it's a very good start for us. I don't know if you want any background on me. I think the bio's out there, but I'm happy to give you a 2-minute if you want it. Great. So, been in the public service for my entire career. Started a couple of years with the federal government, my academic economics and political science at McMaster, and I did public admin in Ottawa at Carleton, and started with the feds for a couple of years, and then spent 33 years with the province. Good portion of that, almost all of it at senior levels. Worked for 11 ministries, 5 as a deputy minister, so all the big ministries. Health, when I was assistant deputy minister of health, that was my first introduction into getting into privacy legislation. So had that background. I was deputy minister of infrastructure, so I did infrastructure planning. We actually ran the second largest real estate portfolio behind the federal government, so I've had that experience as well. So been around a long time, worked very collaboratively with the other levels of government. Quite frankly, has helped me get things done, and much of I would say a lot of my success is a lot of what you're doing, which is engaging, listening, and moving. So.
All right, thank you. Well, welcome. Thanks for joining us, and welcome to Waterfront Toronto.
That's great. Thank you. Now, I do have to apologize, Michael. I did mention up front. Unfortunately, my staff have me back to back in meetings. There's a number of things going on, so I will be leaving partway through. And my apologies for not being able to stay, but I will join you for the next meeting.
All right, thanks. Christina, manager.
Great, so I'll just provide a very high-level overview because we have a number of people who will go deeper on all of these issues here with us today. Of course, the consultations on the draft Master Innovation and Development Plan, the first round has occurred, and Nicole Swerin is here with us today, and she'll provide an overview of some of those outcomes as well as a summary of sort of where we're headed to in the next steps. There is a full report that will be coming out in the next few weeks, so she'll tell you more about that as well. The GSAP preliminary commentary, I feel like you guys are more situated to probably tell us about that than me tell you about that, but just in terms of the timeline out. It was seen as really a watershed moment, I think, in the conversation, and I want to, again, thank you all very much for the thoughtfulness of the remarks that were received. It was really remarkable to see the conversation continuing around these issues and to really see the different perspectives. So thank you so much for all the work that you've done, and Charles and the rest of the team that were intimately involved, Karen, Mark, and Andrew on the writing team. Really appreciate what you pulled together, so thank you very much. The other fact that happened between the last meeting and this meeting is we did amend the plan development agreement, and the details of which are there. That is a public amendment, so that was released so that people have visibility on that. And really that was to allow for more time around consultation and review of the Master Innovation and Development Plan. There was also a new termination point that was actually added for October the 31st that was tied to the threshold issues that were identified in our board chair Steve Diamond's letter. So that work is ongoing right now to work through some of those threshold issues to see if there is a point of alignment that would allow us to proceed to the evaluation process. And the principal implementation agreements were actually moved out by 1 year. If we reach through the threshold issues, if the evaluation is positive, then the negotiation period was actually extended a full year to December of 2020. And then just with regards to the working group meetings, it was the report writing committee that was extraordinarily busy this past little bit. And I look forward to working with all of you over the next course. I just want to make sure I leave time for Nicole and her team to provide context around the consultation as well.
Any questions at all from the panel? No? Okay. In that case, if I can ask Nicole to.
Just give a bit of a verbal update. Nice to be back with all of you. As you know, I think I was here when we had just finished the 4 public meetings, but there were many other components to this first round of public consultation. We had done pop-up sort of drop-in sessions in a program in partnership with the Toronto Public Library across the city, so from Etobicoke to Scarborough, up in North York and down by the waterfront. And we also had an online consultation where the notes that were in Waterfront Toronto's note to, the questions that were in Waterfront Toronto's note to reader were available for long answer responses online. And we also opened the door to written submissions. So we have a report that will be out no later than the end of the month that integrates all of that. we roughly feel we had we just over 1,000 participants in all those different mechanisms. And what the public consultation did, it's not a rigorous, intended to be sort of a statistically significant survey that's a rigorous quantitative exercise. It's designed as a qualitative exercise. And as you know, for the first round, it was really based on orienting people to what was in the MIDP and getting a really first blush sense of how people were thinking about it. So the public consultation through the first round, our observations are that it gave voice to 3 positions related to the MIDP. A couple are very polarized, and many of the remarks were quite polarized. People who are supportive of it tended to be very supportive of it consistently. People who were, and this is particularly clear when you review the raw data from the online survey, all of which will be made available. People who were against it consistently. Those are the two positions. The third position is the most interesting, I think, from sort of where our work can focus, is those voices that said if it does move forward, it has to be on terms that work for Toronto. Basically, if you're going to do it, get a good deal. And there's a short list of what consistently emerges as a good deal. And the first one is geography and limiting the geography. The second one is power and making sure that it's publicly driven. And the third one is all related to digital governance, data collection, and anything related to privacy and issues that are clearly the focus of this panel. So I'd say your work is within the top 3 issues that have been emerging for those folks that say if you're going to do it, you better make sure that you convince us that whatever the arrangement is that it addresses all of the very long list of very thoughtful concerns that have been raised related to digital privacy, digital governance, data collection, data use, et cetera. It also needs to be financially fair. That's the 4th point around those who say get a good deal. It has to be financially fair to the city, and you need to make sure, Waterfront Toronto needs to make sure that it's a good deal for Toronto and supportive of the Canadian business sector. So quite acute awareness that this is a US tech giant and we have a lot of capacity in Canada as well, and thinking all the way through to how do we think about that in the context of the Canadian GDP. So those are in broad strokes the sort of highlights. We also received a number of suggestions around the second round of consultation. People are very much looking forward to that. Most importantly, they said they would like to see that organized around Waterfront Toronto's objectives, which is different than organizing it around the structure of the MIDP. And to please review the proposal from a position of strength, given that great value of that waterfront asset. Specifically, they wanted demonstration around if or how the RFP objectives could be met at Quayside alone, and if not, why not? Complete risk assessment with quite a bit of detail of the types of analysis that I'm sure is already part of Waterfront Toronto's, not sure, but I expect would be part of Waterfront Toronto's rigor in any case, and evaluated in the broader Canadian and global context. So people are online all the time. They're able to see what's happening in other cities and other jurisdictions, and they would expect that the work that's happening at Waterfront Toronto is as aware as they are, and more aware than what's happening elsewhere in the world. So I understood that you might have some suggestions for our team on how to specifically handle some of the consultation in round 2. I'm happy to receive them now or through whatever mechanism makes most sense for you as a group. And I think that's it from me.
Why don't we open it up for questions? I welcome questions from the phone as well, but can I just ask anyone who's not asking questions to put their line on mute?
I think for Skype it's *6.
Nicole, I know that I don't know if this is a fair question or not, but I know that you've got a long rich experience with doing these consultations. Was there anything in this, because you mentioned, people fell into 3 groups, the ones who were against, the ones who were for, the ones in the middle. I know that probably happens on, from a condo application to, was there anything about this process or this topic that was different that you found in terms just in your experience from the way things went, types of concerns that the public had.
What I would say was unique about this process was the volume of material, the short period of time, and as a result, we always expect and see quite a range of opinion that emerges on projects. There are usually a few people that are supportive no matter what, a few people that are against it no matter what, and the vast majority in the middle are really, with information and discussion, still figuring out what they think. Because of the short window, I think, between the release of the MIDP and the real intent of the first round was an orientation to that. What I think was interesting is that the yes, I'm for it or against it, people were tempted to have to take that position sooner than they otherwise would be because of not having had a chance to go through it in as much detail. So that being said, there were still, I might say there's 5% at one end, normally 5% at the other, and 90% in the middle. Here, certainly there were many strong concerns raised. Those were more predominant than the people that were supportive through the public consultation, but that's also not that surprising. But there were also, which is very consistent with other consultations, a good core group of very thoughtful folks who said, look, let's talk about the conditions under which we would be willing to live with this or would not be. So it was, from that perspective, I think the polarization was a little more noticeable to us than would have been in the 25 years of my experience. But I think that's a function of how things unfolded early on. And it also has quite a significant media coverage. People are getting their information from all kinds of different sources. And what we like about this is a good consultation involves all the voices. It's a sort of a big tent strategy. For people who don't feel that that tent accommodates them, they go outside of the tent. And it seems to us that the people that, given the results that we received, people were willing to come to Waterfront Toronto's consultation tent. And I think that that's really important. That was one of our objectives that we set with you and the board and others at the start. So we have not heard that there are significant voices in the broader public that did not get expressed through this process.
Mark? Sounds like you have an enormous amount of material to digest and reduce. What form do you see the release of this taking so that people can in fact make use of it, both at a policy level and also the public, because it's part of the informing of the public of the issues?
I very much appreciate the question. We are working, and as we said through all of the public meetings in particular, that we would like to create something that's useful to decision makers, whether they be at this table or out in the community trying to navigate this. And so we are necessarily organizing and then synthesizing feedback because we don't expect that the average person would read every data point. So we will have 1 or 2 pages of broad observations that clearly come from our team. And then we have a synthesis of what we heard at the public meetings, a synthesis of what we've heard at the online survey consultation, and a synthesis of what we've heard from the written submissions. It's a little different nature. So all of that takes about 15 pages in total, maybe 17. So a 2-page observation, which is what I've just shared with you, the 3 voices really emerged. People could have more than one voice, but mostly it was polarized, and then the folks on the get something that works for Toronto. So you'll be able to see a couple of pages about sort of our observation synthesis, and then 4 pages on each of the mechanisms, because they did have a bit of a different flavor. So our expectation would be that if you read all of the detail in all of those different mechanisms, you would agree that the observations that we're making are useful. And what I think is most useful to Waterfront, most influential of the decision making, we always know there's people that are undeniably supportive and undeniably against. But for all of the people that talk about the conditions under which it would be a good deal for Toronto or not a good deal for Toronto, and all of the process advice that we received that was very rich, those are the two pieces that we think people need to focus on and figure out how to apply that for the second round of consultation. So 2 pages
Or
plus 12, conclude if the 2 pages, use the 12 to conclude if the 2 pages works for you.
and then supplementary material?
500 or 600 pages of appendices. Every written submission is there. Every every public meeting summary is there. We've organized the survey, the online survey feedback slightly for utility of use, but all of the raw data is also there. So there were 89 questions in the Note to Reader, organized in 16 sections. Each of the sections had 5 to 10 questions. So there's 682 short to long answer data points, qualitative data points. People can look at all of that.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so everything's there. But we have tried to synthesize it, and it's worth, I think, reminding the group that every one of the public meeting summaries already took an attempt at synthesizing. All of those were distributed to every participant that gave us their email address. They had a week to review the drafts. And in only one case did we have somebody who said, actually, it was a little more this way than that way at my table. We made that change, and those are all finalized. So of the 600 people that came to the public meetings, they've already seen and have not provided us, did not use that opportunity to say that that synthesis was off base. So we're very confident in that already first round of synthesis, which takes all those 4 meetings, and every one of them has a 1-pager that says, here's how we've concluded what happened. So we think I know there's some people, summer is not ideal, but some people might have missed it, but we think there were enough eyes on it that we're reasonably comfortable with how it's been synthesized and hope that it's useful for you.
There's a question on Slido, I'm not sure who asked it. I can just go ahead then, I'm not sure who. Did the lack of accessible materials impact the results?
Accessible, like AODA accessible?
Not sure.
We can double check with the Waterfront Toronto team to see if they received any feedback directly. We did not receive any feedback directly from our team regarding accessibility. We certainly, one of the main messages from the public meetings was the accessibility of the volume of the document. But if AODA compliant is specific, I'd have to do a little homework to get back to you, but it's not something that's risen to, it did not come up on a regular basis at the public meetings, nor in the other mechanisms of feedback that we were using.
Yeah, perhaps I'm not sure, but I don't know who asked it. Perhaps the question was geared at just the volume side of it.
Oh, there's
that
no,
it's just viewed
no
as
question,
inaccessible.
Yeah,
no question.
That's what I think.
Well, then no question, people didn't, one of the most important, not the most important, I think the most prevalent message, one of the most prevalent messages from the public meetings was concern about the document. I mean, I think in that case, we really never, and there has been quite a bit of criticism that we even did a round of consultation 3 weeks after the release. The point was we did it on purpose 3 weeks after the release so we could get people oriented to that document through the lens of Waterfront Toronto. So there was no expectation at any time that people would have read the thing. We already, in public meetings, said it would take 2 months if you read 15 pages every day to get through it, or 3 months, I can't remember. So the volume of material was certainly a challenge. That is why we always planned for the second round of consultation, which we always knew would be driven, or expected would be driven more by what Waterfront Toronto needed for its formal evaluation to help inform the formal evaluation. So, yeah.
I guess specifically on question of sort of the digital architecture, and given the nuances around the economics of digital economy and sort of nuances around control frameworks that are often employed by big tech companies, were any sort of domain experts consulted, or is it at this point it's been mostly public consultation?
This was public, other than what we did through the Civic Labs leading up to this process, but this was public, and we took a look at the written submissions. We only received 10 from organizations, like it wasn't such a big list. And only a couple of those 10 really focused in on the digital piece. I think this group has made it quite clear that there are other routes to provide more specific technical expertise related to and deeper expertise around digital. But for example, the Institute for Advancing Prosperity focused a lot on the data trust. The Council of Canadian Innovators missed chance to provide opportunities for Canada's existing capacity. Coalition Against Technological Development clearly relates to this group, but the others didn't. Of the written submissions, we had the Federation of Northern Ontario Municipalities, Swedish Consulate, Unifor, the Waterfront BIA, and of course Block Sidewalk. They had issues. Their issues they raised relate to power and geography. That was the primary focus of their submission, but they touch on and continue to touch on digital issues.
This question might be out of the scope of the consultation topic, so tell me if that's the case. But is there any contemplation to do, like, if we were doing if this was strictly like a economic land development exercise, we might do studies on like the economic positive, negative economic spillover effects of a development. Given that there's such a strong sort of digital economy element of this, do you think there'll be an opportunity to do a study like that, but on the economic spillover effects of the digital piece of this, like bringing in and I was pick them for reference, but like a McKinsey or somebody to come in and do that.
The public would love that. The people that are paying attention to this topic publicly would love that. That's Waterfront Toronto's call.
Yep.
There were a number of suggestions of the types of analysis, and they're quite thoughtful that people would expect to see happen in order to defend a rigorous approach. We've outlined those quite specifically, but from understanding the opportunity cost, comparing this proposal to what else could be done, consider potential consequences, intended and unintended, if you can anticipate an unintended, and outcomes, and the list goes on. So I think that any advice that this group has around the rigor of the analysis that you think is necessary to contribute to a defensible outcome, then you conclude that. Waterfront Toronto figures out what to do with that advice, and then we would figure out how to integrate that into the second round of public consultation. Whether that happens then or this work is really intended to feed into Waterfront Toronto's formal evaluation, which would happen after the second round of consultation.
Just a quick point of clarification. I attended 2 of the 4. I was at North York and at the Waterfront. And like members of the public were sometimes people who were experts in their day jobs who showed up on Saturday too. So I was really impressed with the caliber and the range of conversation, but also how the experts were also patient with people who were new to the table as well. Like it was, kudos to your team, Nicole. It was a really solid engagement process and a good reminder of why it matters to talk to the public. But the public also included experts from their day jobs showing up as members of the public too. It was really high caliber conversations.
We had the CEO of Options for Homes. They do, for example, affordable home ownership. We had the executive director of the Mozilla Foundation. We had other tech experts from other places. We had major philanthropists in Toronto who think about investing in public realm. We had partners in architectural firms. We had academic professors. The caliber of the participation, particularly for those 3 weeks in August, the caliber of the participation was outstanding for a public consultation. So thanks for raising it, Pamela. You're absolutely right. And luckily, Waterfront Toronto recorded one of the 4 sessions, and there's 1 hour of a closing plenary at the George Brown meeting that's on the YouTube site for Waterfront Toronto. It's outstanding. You don't have to listen to every report back, and every room was also recorded, so you can even look, for example, what happened in the digital breakout room. But the quality and caliber of participation was extremely high. And relevant to this group, just reminding me with the 4th breakout room, many people said that it was challenging to review any particular innovation or any element of the MIDP without seeing how it connected to the other pieces. And this came up quite directly related to digital many times. So if you're talking about this innovation, then help me understand the digital layer and help me understand the financial layer. But those, in the way that the material had been shared, was not necessarily fully integrated. So many people said we're excited about the innovation, but they did that without the benefit of understanding what went along with doing that innovation through a digital lens or a financial lens. And in large part, I think that's because volume 3 included a lot of that material, and that came a little bit after volume 1 and 2. And so people were sort of saying, here's some good ideas. And I think the second round, we have to talk about what goes along if you're going to do those good ideas, both from a digital lens, so it has to be integrated across all topics. Notwithstanding, there's some elements you can probably pull out, like the trust, but the influence that the digital layer has on all elements of what we're talking here, certainly people are expecting that to be more fully integrated into this discussion and not isolated.
I understand that you might still be thinking about this with your team, but I'd be interested in the kind of, this was a really unique public consultation in so many different levels. But thinking about the next round, what are kind of the lessons you and your team will take for the next round? And also whether you expect it to be the same level, lower, or maybe even higher in terms of the people participating.
Well, it's not the middle of summer. The number of people that participate in our experience is directly connected to the opportunity to influence a decision. If there's no opportunity to influence a decision, people don't come. If there's a very meaningful opportunity to influence a decision, people come. All of the conversations we've had with Waterfront Toronto tell me that this will be a very meaningful opportunity to influence a decision. And in fact, the second round of consultation will be designed based on the advice from the people in the first round of consultation. So that's another reason that I think people will come. I do think they will be organized differently. There was some utility to breaking people into subject areas because of the way that the MIDP was structured and the pace at which we went out pretty much immediately after. I'm not sure it's going to make sense. I'm quite sure it will not make sense to take that same approach to this next round. We're working with Waterfront Toronto to organize the conversation around Waterfront Toronto's objectives, and then to make sure that the material around those objectives is integrated. And we'll quite likely spend a lot more time all together than breaking out into small rooms. We're figuring out the mechanics of that, because if we do get the kind of turnout, I think, making sure 650 people in the same room have a meaningful opportunity to participate puts the challenge to us to figure out how to do that. So I do think that we got a lot of good feedback. We've also had some people proactively approach us to talk about different ways to do it. So we're certainly expecting something different, and at least the same level, if not more, participants.
Andrew posted a question saying, sounds like an excellent process. Wondering when we'd expect to see the report?
Before the end of the month. We're aiming for sooner, but before the end of the month. The 4 public summaries are out, and you would have had them. And the other pieces, we're just doing some quality control in-house.
Sounds like a massive volume of material
Yeah.
that will be available.
Yes.
That you're synthesizing. And actually,
Making available in raw form too. So if you synthesize it a different way, go ahead.
We will probably have the same, probably question for Waterfront Toronto as well around our DSAP report. But do you have any, just given all the material that's available and all the exercises you've gone through, and there's going to be a second round, do you have some advice, and you don't necessarily have to give it in this venue, but for Waterfront Toronto, to how to actually absorb that amount of material and how it will actually inform the work going forward? Because I think that's one disconnect that often happens with the public, is that there's a lot of exercises that happen in terms of consultation, a lot of videos, a lot of reports, but to be transparent around how that information is actually going to be used, and how then we'll then see it in either a final evaluation by Waterfront Toronto or changes in the final mid-up. So it's like a process for that, and I don't know the answer, but you probably, just given your other projects, would have some background in that and some suggestions for the best way to move forward.
Absolutely. What I can tell you now is that the Waterfront Toronto's Quayside staff team has 20 people or so on it. And they connect to Christina and to Meg and to George and Kevin and Jeff. I mean, there's a lot of people that are showing a lot of leadership. We meet regularly with the leaders of the Quayside team and make sure that what we think is emerging from the consultation informs their thinking at the same time as how their thinking they need to defensively evaluate informs our thinking. So I can't think of a bit like the stage is set. We did this also for the first round in the note to reader, the material that was there, the and other elements of the first round work. And I expect and know that that continues. We continue to meet with them on a regular basis and work very closely. And refreshingly, usually when they want to get Waterfront Toronto's team wants to get something done, it's very consistent with how they're thinking about it is very consistent in many ways with what we're hearing from the public consultation. And where it's different, we raise it. They're very open to listening to it. Where they've got something that they need to get comments on and it wasn't something we anticipated, we think about it and figure out how to do it in a meaningful way. So what I like about your question is it tells me there should be some transparency in the evaluation about how that happened, and we will work to make sure that we describe exactly how that happened. The best is you said, we did, and not all the you saids can be good.
Yeah.
Some of them are tough. In fact, here a ton of them are super tough. So this was really hard. This is what we were able to do with it. And where we weren't able to do something, this is why not. And I think that's the great burden of working in the public interest, which is significantly different than working in the private interest.
Anyone on the phone? Hearing none, let me just ask one quick question for you. I'm curious, given that it's acknowledged a lot of people are showing up not having read the MIDP because it's just too much to read. Do you find that views are changed over the course of spending time within one of these consultations?
Absolutely.
Or do people come in with a set view and that's it?
Absolutely. People, the vast majority of people who come to an in-person public consultation are not there with an axe to grind and they're not going to change their mind no matter what. That is not how these processes are designed, and it's also not how the broader public who chooses to participate in these processes typically presents themselves. People who bother to make time to come, regardless of what they think or don't think coming in, are very open to, in the vast majority of cases, listening to what was presented. And I know that Meg and Christina in particular, from their overview presentations and the staff teams in the breakout rooms, while not everybody agreed with what they were saying, we heard many people say they really appreciated the approach. We saw a lot of people learn things and thinking things that were different. I mean, a lot of people very intelligently said, well, I know more than when I got here, but I'm not ready to make up my mind. And I think that that's quite a sane position to have if you hadn't read it.
All right, well, thank you very much for
My
all the
pleasure.
work you've been doing.
My pleasure. Looking forward to seeing you again. Good luck with your own deliberations.
From that consultation process to ours, Charles, present on our work.
Thank you. So as you all saw on Tuesday, the preliminary commentary and questions on the Cyber Labs draft Master Innovation and Development Plan was published. I will be calling it the commentary for the rest of this presentation. The panel, obviously all of the panel contributed to this. We struck a smaller report writing working group in order to do that. Andrew Clement, myself, Karen, and Karen Gomez. So thank you for your work on that, and also thank you to Vance for helping us so much through helping with the collation publication. Basically, the report had a very specific scope, so this is in partial fulfillment of our mandate to provide advice on digital strategy to the Waterfront Toronto management and by extension government partners with respect to the Toronto Waterfront and with special attention to Sidewalk Lab's proposal. And most of this particular commentary was on the MIDIP, obviously. The commentary, as has already been mentioned, was not a final evaluation of the actual MIDIP. It was it outlines areas that the panelists felt that they looked to see addressed. It was not a consensus report, so it's not a final opinion of the panel on the MIDIP itself, but rather a collection of individual comments from panelists. There is a summary and that I'll discuss in a minute, but the summary was drawing out themes that were emerging from the comments that created, rather than a consensus opinion. And we felt the value at this stage, given the time that we had, the size of the plan, the time that we had to review it, that the sort of frame that we wanted to bring to it was questions to be asked, gaps to be addressed, areas that we felt would help Waterfront Toronto in their final assessment, eventual assessment of the report, rather than an exhaustive tally of here's all the things that were good, here's all the things that were bad. The structure of the report, there was general summary of the panelists' comments along the broad categories that you see there on the screen. There was a summary of a summary, if you will, that I'll talk about in a second, that was drawn out by the report writing working group. And then there's an appendix that basically has all of the comments collected, also grouped thematically. Process, so we formed the working group, we solicited comments. We sort of had a rough outline, but panelists also contributed their own questions and concerns around maybe areas that weren't in the original outline. We took all those comments, we consolidated them, grouped them out into their themes. We circulated all of the comments to panelists for review and comment, and we then drafted our summary and observations. The panel reviewed and signed off, and we delivered it to Waterfront Toronto. The final report and design was Waterfront Toronto helped us with the actual production of the report, and there was an accessibility review conducted to make sure that the document was fully accessible, and then we shared it with Waterfront Toronto Board, government partners, Sidewalk Labs, and released to the public. So that's the rough process. A quick summary of the comments. So we found, as a reminder, this is a high-level summary, so this doesn't mean that every single panelist felt the same way, and it doesn't mean that every single comment fell into these four buckets. But overall, it was felt that, and some of these are echoed, some of the public concerns as well, that the MIDIP was not sufficiently specific about the digital innovation proposals. And more specifically, that what we saw was, given that in the MIDIP writ large, there's a number of digital innovations, there's a number of quasi-governmental bodies that are proposed, and then there's a interface with the built environment. And so there's a lot of moving parts, and we felt like that panelists felt there were a lot of comments around the idea of a minimal viable plan. In other words, if 3 or 4 of the technologies either weren't accepted or failed, what did that mean for the plan overall? So we felt it would be better to get a better sense of how the plan would move forward in terms of what's important, what's not. Some questions around scope as well, in terms of the geographic scope and the additional geographic scope that was added. Another area in which there's not sufficient detail was, what is the path to participation in the development of the technologies? Not just in terms of consultation, but actually substantive and agentive participation by the public, by residents, by civil society, by startups in the private sector, and public bodies to participate from a design and implementation and operation perspective of these technologies. The citizen and resident a lot of panelists felt that the citizen and resident was not at the center of the design process itself. And finally, there were similar comments on the document that the public also expressed around its accessibility. Beautifully designed, but in some cases unsearchable, repetitive, and there was no index, and the sources could not be clicked on, various things like that. Digital innovations, more specifically, so it was the panelists felt like they needed a closer connection to how digital infrastructure, launch services, and the other digital innovations in Superplan, Koala, would support the Waterfront Toronto goals as stated for Quayside. So there was a lot of what in the document, but more how those proposed innovations would accomplish these goals. And in many cases, there are other technologies that already exist in the market. Why were these proposals superior to alternatives that exist? And what accountabilities we put in place. There were a lot of comments around data governance and privacy. So the notion of the urban data trust, there were many comments from panelists who felt that was the proposal was problematic in those terms. That it for various reasons, but primarily around the idea that we already have a set of public bodies, we have a regulatory framework. How would the trust work within that? There was the notion of urban data has constantly been considered problematic by the panel. And it also was felt that the urban data trust in place might place limitations on access by public bodies to data that they currently have the right to have access to, but also citizens and academics doing their research. Also felt like the going forward, Waterfront Toronto and government partners should actually be the ones who are driving the proposals on data governance. And the Sidewalk Labs should actually focus on how its own proposals will be transparent, accountable, and amenable within a privacy protection regime. There's also some concerns around what actions would be taken in the case of privacy breaches, and we see in the news every day that these breaches take place. What is the process for that in case that happens? Finally, another bucket of comments around intellectual property and economic development. So, though panelists were encouraged by the fact that Sidewalk Labs were recognizing the value of the public input into the development of these technologies, but it didn't seem to be sufficiently valued in terms of the percentages and length of time. Value sharing agreements did not seem to be sufficient. Also, there seemed to be some problematic proposals around IP with the local urban innovation industry in terms of how that might limit later expansion by those firms internationally from a patent perspective, and then some of the proposals that were put in place in terms of encouraging that the urban innovation industry did not seem to be sufficient. So, very high level on the comments in the commentary. Next steps. So the next step is we're going to have probably a short discussion after I finish these comments. Sidewalk Labs later today is appearing before us with some additional material and some questions and comments there. We anticipate going forward that there will be, and the panel is going to ask this, that we get some additional information from Sidewalk Labs, including a detailed reconciliation document. For how the comments have been addressed in the final version of the MIDIP. And as was mentioned earlier, we also we recognize that some of those comments are better addressed by Waterfront Toronto or government partners or perhaps even civil society. And we're probably going to go through an exercise to identify who those people should be going forward. In some cases, it may be all three. We'll see each comment is different. Upon receipt of the final MIDIP, we will undertake as a panel a final evaluative review of the plan with a view to producing a consensus report. Given the diversity of views and the different areas of experience, we likely will have some minority reports as well accompanying that. And then in terms of how we're going to produce that next report, we will consult with the panel, the report writing working group will consult with the panel on what the process and mechanisms for that should be. We may even have different people on the report writing working group going forward. We shall see. And the final review, the final evaluative review will be shared and published publicly as we have the commentary. So thank you. Those are my comments, and I'd like to leave some time if anyone else would like to jump in, any of the other, either the working group or other panelists. Any other comments?
Sorry, Michael. Can I just wanted to thank you again, and because I'm going to have to head off to another meeting. But I do look forward to working more directly with you over the next little while, and that was a great start. But as I mentioned to Christina, even breaking out the recommendations or comments that relate to us, we'd like to engage you on that
Great.
topic.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're really happy to have you here at this table.
Yeah, thank you.
Karen, and then I have Andrew after.
Sure. Well, I just want to say that Vance did an incredible job, even from the first draft. We were amazed how articulate the panel sounded. And I think it just goes to say that, in the role that Vance has to play in this organization and in this process, there's so few people that could do that. And Waterfront really, you got a good one.
I just want to make sure he knows I heard that.
Thanks, Karen. Andrew? Okay, we
Yes,
can't-
just to underscore, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good. I just want to underscore what Karen said about Vance, and also I think, as you might have seen, that Charles played a very nice role, at least sort of keeping us together and filling in the gaps. So I appreciate that. I'm also struck by how well the panelists responded. This is a very short time frame. We it was only a couple of weeks to try to get your head around this massive document, and we got a rich set of material there to work with. So I look forward to the next stage. It's going to be more demanding, of course, because we'll have to integrate it, but I think we've got a good base, particularly because I think while we didn't discuss much the differences of views and try to have to align them, there is a fair degree of consistency, I think, among the panelists in terms of how they've approached the MIDT. So I think that's a very good sign going forward. Of course, we will be on your reminding you to contribute and to this, and hope we don't have to harass you too much. People were generally very responsive, so which we appreciated. But there's going to be a big job next, and then we'll actually have to try to bring our ideas together. But we have a good start on that. So I'm optimistic about that. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
And just to add to Andrew, I realize a lot of you were on holidays when you answered our emails, so we really appreciate that. We got a lot of out of notice, but you still answered and took the time to respond really thoughtfully.
Anyone else on the panel with any comments?
No, I've got nothing to add to that, so it's.
Okay, well, thanks again. I think we're all really appreciative of the work that was done by Vance and by the entire committee. And say there's more work to be done, but this was, I think, a really good start. So thank you. Okay. All right, we're a few minutes ahead of schedule. If we can move, we've got now a couple of presentations that are coming up on potential Waterfront Toronto activities. And I'll hand it over to Christina to provide some context.
So we are at an interesting point in the lifespan of the panel. You exist beyond just the Quayside project to advise Waterfront Toronto more broadly on digital initiatives. And we are beginning to hear of opportunities for us to become engaged with activities that are happening adjacent to this project and related to smart cities in general, which has been a long-standing part of the work that we do here through our intelligent communities work. So we're going to begin to receive some presentations from external groups who have approached Waterfront Toronto and either to share information or to see if there might be an opportunity for us to engage with them to further our thinking as well in this space. So these are our first two external presentations, which are actually somewhat inside-outside. But I would just encourage you, if there are other initiatives that you think we should be learning about or considering becoming engaged about, to also raise those with us at management, and then we'll come back to the panel to see if it seems to be a good fit with the work that we have ongoing. So, thank you.
That's great. Can you bring up Yuta's presentation?
While that's coming up, I can start talking. This presentation is, I tried to keep it quite simple. So the title of this particular initiative is called the Personal Data Preference Standard, and it is currently a draft standard within the IEC International Standards Organization process. if you could go to the first slide. Do I have it? Okay.
I got it. It's okay.
Okay, so this, I wanted to speak a little bit to the origin of this particular project. It comes out of the Inclusive Design Research Center and out of our studies of what happens to data, specifically to individuals that are at the margins, that are outliers, that are statistically not within the norm or the average or typical. Anyone unique or outlying. And one of the things we discovered was that many of the data protections that we have proposed, which I've sort of repeated here a number of times, are not addressed through anonymization at source. If you look at who can be re-identified, if you are highly unique, and especially as data gets aggregated, it is very, very simple to re-identify you. That particular fact exists together with the fact that the individuals that are most easily re-identified are then also the ones that are most vulnerable to abuse and misuse of their personal data. So whether it's fraudulent sales, identity theft, insurance denial, I mean, we can go through all of the forms of data abuse and misuse. If you talk to any fraud policing unit or look at any of the statistics, that there's a correlation between who can be re-identified and who is at risk of or vulnerable to data abuse and misuse. So this was a huge concern for us that we've been investigating and trying to find approaches for. Next slide. Oh, right, I have it now, okay. So the particular practice that we were most concerned with and where a lot of this abuse and misuse was appearing was the all or nothing terms of service agreements, which of course have become an assumed convention. Most companies we found, I mean, there are the large players who have their own legal boilerplate, but most companies seem to be using existing boilerplates which had huge overreach, which had nothing to do with the service that they needed to provide or the actual data that they required. Most consumers never read the legalese before clicking I agree. And I agree in a number of the legal cases has stood in for informed consent. So in many jurisdictions, and if you recall, this is we're doing this at an international scale. In most jurisdictions globally, the clicking I agree, despite the fact that you haven't read it and despite the fact that you may not understand it, is seen as informed consent. And most of the agreements, especially all of the boilerplates that are most popular with small companies that don't have the legal wherewithal to find or create their own boilerplate, allow for data to be aggregated and shared with third parties. So that was a concern. So what we had an opportunity in that I had created in 2007, or I had been the editor, and we had a standard adopted called the Access for All standard. It's an ISO IEC 24751 or IMS Access for All. It comes in a number of standards organizations depending upon how it's implemented. But the primary purpose of the standard was to support platforms that match individual preferences to available matching resources. And this came out of the recognition that due to lack of economies of scale, due to many other things, the markets were not addressing the needs of people that had marginal or minority needs, especially critical marginal or minority needs. And so there needed to be some other market frameworks that could be used. And so it's been implemented in open education resource finding, and matching user interface configurations. The idea is that you create a portable preference file and then you can take it wherever you happen to go or wherever you happen to need it. But the important part of this particular standard and design is that it supports layers for discovering, exploring, defining, and stating those personal preferences in a machine-readable way so that a platform can actually operationalize it. And what that means from a personal data point of view is that there can be many ways to educate somebody about the implications of particular preference choices. So that it can be done in multiple languages at multiple levels of understanding and literacy. And there has been development of these exploration, discovery, refinement, and feedback loops within the platforms. It also acts as a way to identify unmet needs and gaps in service. So for public policy or public services and governments to understand that these are major gaps that exist where there isn't in fact any supply to meet a particular demand. And it supports a feedback layer to refine the negotiations between the stated preference and what can be supplied. So we thought that would be a good mechanism. The other advantage of this particular standard is that it is, as where most ISO standards are not publicly available and they are purchased for a fee, this one, due to negotiations we made early on, was a publicly available, transparent, and no fee standard. So it is the framework under which we created a draft multi-part to that multi-part standard. And it, like the rest of that particular standard, there are two parts and a negotiation which can happen within a platform. The first part is for the personal data producer, the person that is creating the personal data. They can discover, explore, refine, and state the preferences regarding how they want their personal data to be treated. Who do you trust with what data, for what purpose, under what conditions, for how long? So you can state and understand the implications of your preferences regarding your personal data. And then on the other side, the service that wishes to use the data has to declare in an auditable and transparent way what data is essential to offer that particular service, and in a way that can be challenged. And then the notion is that platforms can then negotiate that particular match. The standard is currently still in draft form, but with the ISO process, there is there's encouragement to find reference implementations so that as the standard goes out of through its multiple drafts, there's actually pilots of the practices to support the design of the standard, and some of the things that are as yet still being discussed or designed are things like multiple party negotiations. The classic example is somebody wants to prove that they're of age to a bar. The only data that needs to be released to the bar is a yes or no, not their birth date, not their name, not their identity, etc. And so how is that type of negotiation created between the government, the bar, and the individual? Some of the other things that are under discussion are classifying data. So what is the boundary of what is considered personal data? And of course, this has recently been complicated with the GDPR and but also the introduction of things like urban data. In fact, that came up at one of the ISO meetings. So what part of urban data is in fact personal data that would fall under this particular personal preference standard. And the other point of discussion right now is where would these matching platforms occur? At the moment, they're run by libraries, by governments, by school boards, etc. Because the resources that are being matched are from federated pools of resources that are run by these different public institutions. So there's discussions of data trusts and also platform co-op data trusts. So ownership by the data producers or the individuals with the personal data, and governance of how that's modeled on things like Me Data, which is a health data trust out of France. So that's the current state of this particular draft standard. As I said, it's still in draft standard. The one difficult thing about it being an ISO process is that ISO is not open to much public review. It's by member body representatives, and much of it is under confidentiality agreements. So there's been a bit of tension and friction between our inclination to run public consultations in this and the ISO process. The other thing that is complicating things is that ISO is pushing to withdraw the publicly available standards and threatening to withdraw the publicly available status of our prior standard. And so we're actually in the process of negotiating with the World Wide Web Consortium and other standards body that are more amenable to open, transparent access to a particular standard. But that is so the proposal or the discussion that's is would the activities of Waterfront be a potential reference implementation where we could pilot some of the things that have been produced. Undergirding the standards process and negotiations is quite a bit of development and interfaces or proposed interfaces and models and prototypical systems that would be used in the standard.
Curtis, and I have Andrew as well.
I think this is really fascinating. Have you ever looked at blockchain as a mechanism to enable the matching platform?
Yeah, so the standard is intended to be quite lightweight, and blockchain isn't ruled out in terms of a way of achieving that negotiation. But this is a longer. I mean, there's a. I think we have a 30-page document about pros and cons of using blockchains or other disintermediated systems to do the one-to-one negotiation. But yeah,
If
that's on the
publicly
agenda.
available, I'd love to take a look at that too.
Yeah, we're also talking to Solid and our Solid group and various other database-related negotiations.
Okay, Andrew, and then Kevin.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Yuta. I wasn't able to read or see your presentation. Just I don't have access to it, but in principle, I'm very supportive of this. I think it is a terrific initiative, and I have a bit of an idea of how much work has gone into getting it to the point of a draft ISO standard. So I wish you very well in that, and I think that we're Waterfront Toronto to adopt such a standard for its own in the areas of which it is operating. I think that would be an excellent precedent. I see the one of the promises of a sort of smart city project in the waterfront as being offering the possibility that when you enter that space, you are entering a space where you have more rights that are better respected than you do in the rest of the city. And I think this is a step towards that. So I'm very supportive in principle of that. I have a question about your important point around the overreach of the terms of service, which are typical. They're widespread. They're endemic. And I recall a talk given by the late, great, and sadly missed Ian Kerr, a colleague of a couple of you about terms of service and a binary alternative, yes or no, with a very strong overreach of acceptance. And I recall that his point was that actually that not conform that does not conform with the legal requirement. You can't ask somebody to provide more information than is necessary for a service by in that way. And I just wonder whether those around the table who know more about this can provide some comment on the legal aspect of those things I'm sorry, I understand I'm fading in and out. I'm not sure what I can cut it.
So, Andrew,
Anybody?
if I can restate, you were asking whether that overreach is common, legally allowed, and specifically, are you talking about in the context of Waterfront or in the Canadian context?
Well, I guess in the Canadian context generally,
Right.
whether that overreach is legally permissible. I would guess that Michael and Yuta and Teresa Vance may have thoughts on that.
So there have been some successful challenges to that overreach and the use of data, but not the majority of cases that have been brought forth have ruled that it is informed consent when you click agree, which is kind of and here I'm talking on an international perspective. I haven't I'm not so as part of the ISO process, we had to do a survey of all of the various jurisdictions and countries, and what came out of the various legal processes was that most of them ruled towards recognizing clicking I agree as informed consent.
Just before we go to Kevin, Chantal, I know you're on the phone. Do you have any thoughts of that, especially in light of the GDPR?
Well, what struck me is that we are obviously talking about special categories of data, and therefore with a very specific legal regime applicable to it.
No, actually, we're not. This is very. I mean, the Access for All is used very generically as a portable preference file. It was originally came out of Web for All, which was a Canadian project back in the Connecting Canadians initiative, where there were multi-user workstations and on a Bell calling card and a Royal Bank, whatever, the part of the purse was used to be able to just automatically get the station to adhere to your preferences and to keep your bookmarks. So the idea was every time you entered a library or you approached a CAP site, you would be able to get it to immediately adopt all of your preferences. So that the framework is similar. It's intended to again be a way of not having to, first off, continuously every time read through all of the legalese and say what it is that is your preference with respect to your data, but to be able to portably take that from one negotiation to the next.
Kevin?
So I understand that this is still a work in progress, but
It's definitely a work in progress.
but you've mentioned GDPR, and I'm thinking open banking as well. So are those instances informing the ISO standard, or is it the other way around, where like
So there's quite a large representation within the ISO subcommittee working group in from the European Union. The majority of working group members are from Europe, so there's a fairly sizable amount of input from regarding the GDPR and how this integrates with the GDPR.
so then thinking about open banking, like are people already looking, I guess what the question is, are people already looking to the standard to develop their own infrastructure and their own policies already, even though it's not an official standard yet? I.e.,
There's some,
is that
yes.
something we should be adopting, given that the state that it's at? Is it sufficiently mature work that, you know, it's not gonna change largely from when it becomes a standard? Or do we have instances of those that are already starting to adopt some of the principles?
If we were to participate in the process, it would be as early adopters to help shape the standard. So there's quite a few practical questions that haven't been answered as yet. So it wouldn't be, we take this off the shelf and we just do it as is. It would definitely be to help inform it and because there are I mean the status of this area is moving so quickly and there are policies arising all the time. So it would be to help to shape this.
We would be contributors to it, to evolve it.
Exactly.
One last question from Mark.
Yeah, have you thought at all about the possible relationship between this and Sidewalk's distributed credential proposal? Because it seems to be looking to tackle a similar problem, which is essentially to only disclose that information that's required, such as yes or no at the bar.
Yeah.
The example they use is rental income verification for rental purposes.
Yeah, we have, and in fact that has been the topic of one of the working groups, so to look at what are the similarities, and certainly there's a similar commitment to reducing or the exchange and use of only essential information for the service. There are some pieces to it that are like the preference regarding the time frame. There are some inconsistencies, but yes, we have been.
So they're looking at as essentially the same issue, but from different lenses,
yeah,
or
exactly. Yeah.
And I guess similarly, I'm interested in Estonia and how they exchange information at X Road. Is that a model to be followed, or is that a kind of a different path that they've taken?
So Estonia is also has been a contributor, a liaison contributor to the discussions, and they're actually I probably shouldn't. Yeah, the Estonian model and the critiques that have come out of the Estonian model are being considered.
They're helping to inform
They're helping to inform.
Is that vague enough? Okay. I mean, the reason I asked those is just, I mean, that just shows a body of interest around the topic that makes it worth pursuing. That it's not kind of in any sense isolated. It's something that's already surfaced within the Quayside project, and it's one of the world models for digital government. Estonia is engaged, so I think that makes it of interest to me, certainly.
All right, thanks for that.
So just generally almost summing up the sense of the table, is there kind of, it's like a general positive reception that, like, without making any specific commitments, that looking for opportunities to engage this project would be a good idea, positive idea?
But I think from my question was going to be, I think it is worth pursuing, because this is obviously the questions we're grappling with on this particular project. When we look at, both the regime or the framework within which we're operating, but also practically, someone trying to work within, someone coming into a bar, if you put that at scale, what's the platform to do that, and how does a person untangle all the complexity? And I think this is a very good way of approaching it. My question would be, if Waterfront Toronto was to sign on, how could we practically apply this, perhaps a pilot within this project or elsewhere, to move forward this forward quickly, relatively quickly?
Yeah, so there's support within the reference implementations to do small pilots. Like, I mean, there's no expectation that it would definitely be piloted, so it would be tested and informed through specific contained trials.
So maybe what we can take as a next step is that Ida, Vance, and I will have a further conversation about what that might look like and be able to keep this group informed, and we'll report back in November. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and there's also the opportunity to use some of the other platforms that are being proposed by other jurisdictions. So that there doesn't need to be a major investment in.
Something new.
Okay, so Khaled quickly and
So how does this compare to some of the other alternatives out there? I mean, there are commercial products. It's one called Putty. There may be others that try to solve the same problem. And so how is that different?
So this is different in that most of those are one, the intention is it's an international effort. Two, it's done from the perspective of the personal preference being the leading sort of the priority. There is far more investment in the education and the understanding by, to some extent one of the goals is to protect, especially individuals that are most vulnerable from data abuse, overuse, misuse. But the other is to create informed data producers, so to inform a public that may not have sufficient information about the risks. There's research behind it to show that people either are over-concerned or they are under-concerned. There's very few people that have a well-thought-out, realistic understanding of what are the potential current risks or potential future risks of sharing your data in whatever way. So the idea is to also increase the knowledge of the public. So and I can list many commercial products that purport to do the same, but often it's either in a very paternalistic, don't worry, your data's safe with us, without really giving agency to the individual to decide. This is a log. We can talk about the pros and cons of the various things that already exist out there.
If I could just throw another comment, if I could. Christina, I think in looking at this, I'm sort of reminded of the role Waterfront Toronto played in the Intelligent Communities Initiative, which was basically to act as a catalyst to bring a number of partners together. I mean, I wonder, Waterfront Toronto is not an operational agency that collects a lot of data about people in any meaningful way. But it could act as a catalyst perhaps to convene some people within Toronto to create a meaningful pilot around this kind of thing. So that would be my advice.
then we'll wrap quickly, Curtis.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think just to kind of link this to the conversations we've had about the digital economy, I think this is a really good initiative. The way this stuff often evolves is you have these standards that form based on member contribution, which are often private sector. Then you have patents that are developed around the standards, and the patents are used as a mechanism to enforce certain types of implementations. So the idea that there's this publicly sponsored open standard with members contributing to the standard that don't necessarily have a private, and then to the degree that Waterfront gets involved in that and can use that position to ensure open license of any patents and implementations of the standard that flow from it, that's sort of exactly the kinds of things that I think this group's been sort of warning against over the last year. So I think if we can figure out a way to turn this standard into an implementation, this gives us a medium to do exactly the kinds of things we've been talking about. So.
Okay, well, thank you for that. It was a good discussion. We can move quickly to our second presentation on the Open City Net.
Yeah, everything's captured, yes.
Hi, my name is Andy Best. Can everybody hear me okay? Am I on mic for those on the phone?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
You're getting some
I'm the
nods.
I'm the executive director of an organization called the Open City Network. And my sincere thanks to the DSAP for the invitation today to talk to you about our work. Quick overview about us. We're a registered Canadian not-for-profit organization. We work at a very delicate intersection between technology and public policy. And within our organization, we blend public, private, not-for-profit, NGO. We launched in the spring. We're based out of Kitchener. We have a national mandate that we're growing into. Most of our organic activity has been in Ontario to date, but we have been bouncing around nationally a little bit. And we're funded primarily through memberships and strategic partnerships. So why are we here? What's the problem that we're trying to solve? You folks know more than most that technology has collided with democracy in Canada. So what does that mean to us? Broadly speaking, all of this smart city work is happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a regulatory vacuum, in a governance vacuum, in a public policy vacuum. And so what we see as cities are increasingly deploying connected data gathering infrastructure and the complex systems that underpin them, that we're facing a significant risk, which is that we are outsourcing control over the public domain to a handful of large vendors, selling closed systems that can encroach on public control of our own infrastructure and the data that it generates. It's important to note this is not some future state that we're talking about. This is happening now in large and small ways all across the country in different cities. If we allow that to continue, then the effect of that would be a slow erosion of the capacity of our cities to fulfill the mandate that we've given them and to govern their own infrastructure and operations. I frame it this way because when you use terms like democracy, does it mean we're going to stop having local elections? No, that's not what that means. But when you think about the capacity of the local public sector to oversee and govern and manage their own domain, that's what we're talking about, a slow erosion of that capacity. If we want to avoid this future, and I very much do, the solution is that certain aspects of the smart city, digital architecture, standards, protocols, must be built and maintained in the public interest. We have to put the interests of cities first as we do this work. So we do two things under a broad umbrella of a city-first approach. First, we have an advocacy agenda. We advocate for open architecture to be our technological foundation, for the value of public data to stay in public hands. Now, I mean the value of public data in a couple different ways here. One, the institutional innovation value. Becoming a more data-driven organization, using data to reduce silos and enable collaboration within government. So that's on the one hand. The second way is, I mean, literal cash value. Like as cities increasingly deploy connected infrastructure, the data streaming off of that, off of those systems, has immeasurable value to the private sector because of what else they're able to correlate it with. They have whole reams of what we do in our private lives, and data from the public domain can significantly increase that. So the public conversation around what we do about that, the value of public data, is not mature enough to prescribe any sort of solution right now. But what we don't want is, for a while we're figuring that out from a strong, public policy and public governance perspective, we don't want external actors to scoop that under us. Furthermore, we argue for a modernized regulatory framework to govern smart city technology. We know a lot about what this technology can do in cities, but we're overdue for a number of significant conversations about what it should be doing in our cities. And finally, we argue for sustained investments in the digital and cultural modernization of our cities as well. This is, again, back to the institutional innovation or modernization value. You can't slap a sensor on something and become a smart city. There is a whole world of cultural modernization, technological modernization that has to happen within the institution as well. So that's what we argue for. We also have programming. Our main work stream is to build digital public infrastructure. The current approach to building smart cities in Canada lacks a systematic emphasis on open architecture, on interoperability, on strong public governance, and on protecting the value of that public data. We are working to reframe how we're going to build smart cities in Canada as a public works project, where maximum value accrues to the public sector and to society more broadly. It's important to note significant private benefit accrues from that as well. Right? Think about highways built in the public interest, significant private value over the long term. So it's a bit of a penny wise, pound foolish approach. We can enable maximum value to accrue to a small handful of private actors, right, over a short term, or by taking a more public sector, public works approach, we can ensure that we are both modernizing our local government institutions and also nurturing the development of a vibrant Canadian technology sector as well. And to our point about how technology tends to swamp government, preventing it from putting in place strong public policy and governance foundations, we are trying to work more symbiotically with government. We welcome them into our membership and our governance as well. I'll talk about that in a second, to ensure that, again, the digital architecture standards and protocols that will come to underpin smart cities are built on strong governance, regulatory, and policy foundations. So, in terms of what specifically we're doing, we're not at the point where we're talking about our plans publicly in that level of detail, but I can tell you a few things. First is that many of you may have heard Mr. Balsillie updated the data is the new oil analogy, comparing it to plutonium. I'll paraphrase, capable of great destruction if mishandled, right? But under tightly regulated, careful situations, it can be harnessed for significant public good. That resonates deeply with me, and that is our approach to data as well. So if you accept that premise, plus the notion of smart cities as public works, then you start to get different questions to the answers of how do you enable data sharing in the public interest? How do you standardize our cities, not only within themselves, but city to city and city to province and city to feds as well. We are trying to optimize government in the public interest, built on strong public policy foundations. So in terms of involvement opportunities, that was the framing of the invite here today. We have a board that we've recently finished recruiting public sector members for. So we were founded a couple Canadian technology companies plus a startup grant from a provincial agency called Compute Ontario. It's funded fully by the Ministry of Economic Development. We created 3 public sector board seats in our first meeting so that we're trying to work in the public interest at that, I call it the delicate intersection of technology and public policy for a reason, right? In our perspective, that in order to do that, we need to have the public sector embedded within our governance as well at the highest level. So we've finished recruitment for our 3 public sector members. We're very excited to be announcing them later this fall. Our membership is open to NGOs, to relevant private sector organizations, especially to cities as well. And then also we enter into a variety of sponsorship or strategic partnership opportunities. So if you're wondering what the difference between those two things are, if you think about what we're doing as putting together a working coalition, not a talking coalition, but a working coalition of actors who share this view and are going to work to build this future. Membership is for organizations that want to support the work and roll up their sleeves, and then sponsorship or some other sort of partnership is for organizations that are interested in supporting it, but might not want to be at the table for that kind of granular level. That's it. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Karen and Colette.
Sure. I have a few. As you would know, this is my bread and butter, and my job is largely thanks to the work you used to do. I think my big question is whether there's assumptions of maturity for members. Obviously, there's a lot of cities in Canada, and some of them are still using paper forms. So if you're talking about the smart city, is there an assumption of the level they need to be at to be able to engage and roll up their sleeves, as you've mentioned. So is there a risk of creating have and have-nots with this network?
That's a fantastic question, and I'll refer back to our fourth advocacy point around the digital and cultural transformation of cities. That's there very deliberately, and there's a reason why we're not cranking out code today. We could be, but we're not. The work that we're doing is a huge lead pass for the public sector, and we are trying to help them skate like hell to get there, to meet us there. And so it's part of our role, not only on the advocacy side to raise the alarm, if I can say that, around what we view to be the risk, the long-term risks with the current approach that we're taking, but also to create space for public sector organizations of varying maturities to participate in this work. What we've seen so far is, some want to be involved at a leadership level, at a strategic level. Others are, just starting out their smart cities journey, if you want to call it that. And it's very important for us that one, the barrier to entry for the public sector is as low as possible, and then two, that it's for all comers, and that we're helping to enable that transformation as well.
I'm a little bit uneasy about again the general narrative. If we're trying to create an environment that will support startups and an innovation ecosystem where external investors are going to come in and put money to help companies grow, etc. Companies will create standards and protocols and technologies that they'll want to own. They want to own the IP that they can then commercialize and use in other places. I just worry that we're pushing too far in the other direction by creating disincentives for that. Just a general unease, or maybe I'm overanalyzing this, I don't know. Because people are not going to put money into something that's going to be made publicly available, and they're not going to be able to own the IP and commercialize it and make money out of it. It's just how it works. And if you want to grow startups and create companies around this, then we have to take that into consideration. I'm getting an uneasy feeling from that perspective, given the kind of conversations we've had over the last 20 minutes or so. Just an observation.
Karen and Cruz.
So I mean, and you can probably speak from the perspective of the Open Cities Network, but from my perspective, for the large variety of people I've talked to in cities are not necessarily in the business of IP. They're in the business of good solutions that make good sense for citizens. They're very much citizen-centered in that way. So I don't necessarily see that concern. I certainly do think a question worth asking is how you're tackling the other side of the equation. So, I mean, there's an education process from both sides, right? You got to bring cities' capacity up, but you have to, through various mechanisms, whether it's privacy or others, you need to also bring the ecosystem up to how do you engage with cities and help build a smart city for the future.
So full disclosure, I am on the board of the Open City Network and was I'm the CEO of one of the companies that Andy referenced that helped us stand this up. So the way I look at this is, if you think about a city, okay, the physical city as opposed to the digital city, there's a boundary between the private sector interests and the public sector infrastructure. So we decided at some point that roads should be things that are owned by the public sector, that should be paid for with a common tax base, that would create a network in which we could then build private condominiums and office buildings, right? And for some reason we decided that was the boundary, as opposed to roads should all be privately owned and tolled, right? And I think that what Andy's talking about with technology and democracy crashing into each other, if you sort of think of the city now as there's a digital representation layer that's going to emerge. It is emerging in front of us. You're right that is entirely controlled by the private sector, and the risk is that we will inherit a future where roads, the metaphorical digital roads, are owned by the private sector. right? And I think what the Open City Network is trying to do is to facilitate a conversation between the public and private sector to decide to engage in a conversation that sort of leads us to where is that boundary, like what should be considered roads and what should be considered private property. And if the conclusion at the end is everything should be considered private property, and we're quite fine living in a world where the digital infrastructure is owned by the private sector, then maybe that's the conclusion. But I think what Andy's saying is that there isn't even that we're not even having that conversation at a conscious level right now. And I worry we wake up in 20 years living in having inherited the implications of not having had that conversation, and we don't like it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think just to put like a practical element to the degree, basically your postal code decides how you experience living to some degree. Like, just think of Parks and Rec registration, registering your kid for anything. In the city of Toronto, it's a very different experience from doing that in another city. In some ways good, in some ways bad. And those decisions are sort of being made on the fly. And when you make a bunch of little decisions all at once, you can end up in that position.
Andrew, I see you there, and now I see Mark. I'm going to jump in and put myself in the queue. We're an organization that talks about as open as the very first word. Respectfully, you don't feel all that open. Your website's got nothing on it about who the funders are. You're doing a consultation amongst members, and it's not clear who the members are. You have to go to a briefing document to learn that Curtis and some other companies were there in the first place. So, who exactly are you, and who's behind this? And do you intend to become a bit more transparent about who's backing you?
So, fair question, and I appreciate it, and thanks for giving me the gears on that. With respect to the website, it's mainly a capacity issue that I'm almost single-handedly standing up this organization and have been over the last couple of months. You can expect to see, I would say, before Christmas, a website that you would expect to see that highlights members, funding, etc. As you said, the information's there, maybe slightly harder than you like to find. So in terms of who is on our board, who are we? As I mentioned, we were founded through coming together of public and private. So 4 companies were the founding members of our board: Myovision, Esri Canada, Geotab, and Maptin. These are 4 Canadian technology companies. They joined with Compute Ontario, which, as I mentioned, is a provincially funded not-for-profit organization funded by the Ministry of Economic Development. And one of my, again, to be transparent, one of my conditions of taking the job was that we create those 3 public sector board seats because we have to embed the public sector into our governance as well, not just into our membership, right? So we spent the last 4 months recruiting those members to make sure we had the right fit. We have finalized that, and we'll be announcing them in the next 6 weeks, I hope. Did that answer your questions?
Something.
Okay, I'm happy to keep going if you have one
No,
more.
that's okay. That's. I mean, if the information's forthcoming, that'd be great. But I mean, you're engaged in an advocacy campaign. I mean, and you're quite explicit about what your goals are. It helps to know who the weed is when you say you're doing advocacy.
I agree, and I accept the irony.
And okay, thanks. And Andrew and Mark, and then I think we'll perhaps try.
I'm not sure whether. Thanks. I'm not sure whether my sound comes through. So, Michael, perhaps you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Read the. Oh, okay. So I just wanted to say this is an interesting and welcome opportunity of Open City the network. But my question is about Andy, could you elaborate on how OCN connects with other smart city developments in Canada, and notably in particular the Open Smart City initiative of Open North. I emailed you about that yesterday, and but perhaps you could say a bit more just about your alignments, and if you want, if you have time, the other Smart City Challenge in Canada. I'm just trying to get a better sense of how you fit within this burgeoning sort of ecosystem in Canada of a variety of these initiatives.
Sure, thank you, Andrew. And again, for transparency, I'll say the same thing publicly that I did to Andrew in private last night. Huge supporter of Open North. They've done foundational work in this country, in this space, to raise the capacity of cities to do this work. Jean Noé, their ED, and I keep in touch about our evolving work programs. It is it's a delicate moment when you jump into this pool. Trying to work collaboratively takes time to find your niche with every organization. So I hope to, have practical program collaborations with Open North in the future. It's something we're always talking about. More broadly, our perspective on this work is that the more people doing this work, the better. As long as we're, broadly, philosophically rowing in the same direction. I think the size of this space is going to explode over the next 5 years. It's not as if there's not enough work to do on these challenges. And so, I'm always, more is better from my perspective, frankly. And we strike a collaborative approach wherever possible with all the organizations that are in the room. Specifically to the Smart City Challenge, that was, very much up and running prior to our launch. But, I've had friendly conversations. I know that they're considering a round 2. I don't know where they're at with that. I'm sure it might depend on what happens in the next few months federally. But broadly speaking, we are at the point now where we're going to start ramping up provincial and federal engagement. We've been doing it in bits and bobs here and there. But again, we're relatively young and we're ramping up to build a coalition to build what it is that we're talking about and to bring that to reality. And that requires a broad coalition of public and private partners. And to, pardon me, I'm not sure your name, sir, but thank you for your question earlier. I just wanted to add one thing to that, is that part of the thesis of this organization, unwritten thesis, is that public and private don't have a good way of working together on these issues, right? And so we're trying to create a mechanism for that to happen because both sides need each other. This is not a just public or a just private thing, right? Like, we need expertise from all sides. Private sector needs to learn how to work better with government, have more empathy with government, and vice versa as well. So we're trying to push the door on some of those challenging conversations.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on your answer, I don't know that Open North attempts to engage the private sector to the extent that you're looking to do. So I think that's one key distinguishing characteristic. I'm asking as much as telling, but I think that's one key thing. There's a lot of people trying to do work on global standards in this space. We just had an example here with Utah. Ultimately, if we're going to have standards around smart cities, they're not going to be national standards. That's not likely, I would think, Curtis.
You're asking here.
Yeah, I'm asking. Yeah.
I think Canada has a unique opportunity to lead. I think ultimately the standards will be global, or at least supranational. But I think that Canada is unique in that we're small enough to try things and sophisticated enough to get it right. And we have I think a pretty good foundation, like culturally, to consider a balance between the economic outcome and the civic implications of the stuff. So
You're deeper in this sector than I am, so I certainly accept that. So, given that view, I mean, I know you're just in the startup phases, but I would keep my eyes on the global prize as you're looking through the Canadian work, because ultimately, whatever you do in Canada could get swamped from elsewhere, or we could become the leading partner. But you need to have that in your mind from the start.
To be clear, are we talking to my vision, or are we talking to?
I'm talking to I'm talking to Open City. I'm not talking to my vision.
I think, and I don't want to speak for Andy, but I think the genesis of this was that there was a bunch of technology entrepreneurs who were watching what was happening, going, as technology entrepreneurs, we totally understand what's at foot here, right? Like I have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize shareholder return. So I totally get what's happening. However, I also know enough to know that I'm worried about the world my kids are going to grow up in if someone doesn't take a leadership position on this. And so we came together to create this. But I mean, like Andy said, he took this job with some preconditions, and we were happy to have them. It's an independent group. So, and totally take the point about disclosures. I mean, it's in press releases, but it should probably be in websites too.
So I guess I'm just urging you to think about, if you're gonna create standards, think about how those get made into global standards and global architectures. Because otherwise, they'll be obsoleted at some point.
So I appreciate that feedback very much. Standards are a very specific thing, and I use the word delicately. We do not write standards at the OCN, but we do have some form of partnership, let me call it an emerging collaboration to date, with an organization called the CIO Strategy Council. They're accredited by the Standards Council of Canada to write standards. They've been our main collaborative partner to date.
All right, well, thank you for that. Lots of people are really interested in these issues, and it's good to learn more. But we're about 10 minutes past the scheduled time, so why don't we take 5 minutes off of what was supposed to be a 15-minute break, and if we can reconvene in 10 minutes time for Sidewalk's presentation, that'd be great. Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks for being prompt to come back. So, you know, this part of the agenda features a discussion with Sidewalk Labs. We've obviously, as a panel, have had quite a number of those over the last year or so. Today's will be structured slightly differently. Part it'll be similar in the sense that we're going to hear a bit about the appendix, and there'll be a presentation on that and an opportunity for questions. So that's the similar part. The part where there'll be an opportunity to shift things just a little bit is that, of course, we've presented to Waterfront Toronto our commentary. Some of the kinds of things that in there are certainly of interest to Sidewalk, and so there'll be an opportunity for Sidewalk if they may want to seek clarification or have some questions around some of the things that have been submitted. We'll give them an opportunity to do so. If people have immediate responses that they're comfortable with or that they can shed some light on, that's great. If, on the other hand, there are issues that they feel that as a panel or as a committee that we need to take it on board and provide a fulsome response in the same way that Sidewalk has often sought to do when we've had questions, then we can take that approach. Okay, and I'll hand it over.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. I'm Elisa Harvey-Dawson, Head of Legal, Privacy, and Data Governance at Sidewalk. Been in this room many times with you all, but figured I'd state it for the record. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you all so much for all of the feedback you provided. We have a tremendous level of respect for this panel and the background and experience that this panel represents. And I know that at Sidewalk we've learned and grown with each insight that you've provided throughout this entire project. And I am confident that we're going to continue to evolve in a positive direction because of it. And so we're happy to be here today to share more with you about the work that we're doing and to have a really good discussion about the preliminary commentary report. Before we dive in, I did want to do some introductions because I brought reinforcements, and I want you guys and I want you guys to know who they are because we have a fabulous team here. And they will be presenting, two of which will be presenting today, and others that you might hear from during the discourse. So first we have Jesse Shapins. He co-leads an integrated team at Sidewalk that holistically works on urban planning, urban design, and digital innovation. He's leading this effort with Pino Damasio, who's over there, thank you Pino, who some of you know. He's our Director of Planning, who has been working on planning projects in Toronto for decades. What is so unique about the intelligent communities is how deeply interwoven the planning, design, and digital aspects of projects need to be. You can't separate them. And so at all times, we need to be attending to human experience in physical space, digital systems that are embedded in that space, governance across all of this, and the overall policy and social implications of it all. And so experts like Pino and Jesse, as they know, this holistic approach is what urban planning has always been about. And so rather than think about the many digital aspects of this project as separate and distinct, this team that they work on, we see them as fundamentally a part of planning. Jesse's background is both professional and academic. He has a PhD in architecture and urban planning, and his research was on the history of cities and technology. He also started a research lab at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, and founded multiple nonprofit and for-profit tech orgs. Sidewalk, and especially this fully integrated team, brings all of this together. We next have Jackie Liu, who you'll hear from as well. And she grew up in Mississauga. And I had to practice saying that, and I hope I got it right, Jackie. And after her family immigrated here from Hong Kong, she came back last year and has been working on how data can play a role in addressing urban challenges. Jackie is incredibly modest and didn't want us to talk so much about her, but I have to because she had a day named after her by the mayor of New York City when she left. I don't have a day named after me in New York. Because for 20 years, she's been working in the Parks Department, where she led the largest participatory street mapping effort in North America, created a new data analytics and open data teams, really building new capacity for how to effectively use data to improve service delivery and operations in close concert with both New York residents and the civic tech community. And so both Jesse and Jackie live here in Toronto, and they work closely with everyone across our teams on the integration of physical, digital, and operations. And a core part of this is working very closely with Craig and Prame, who you've met. And I'm not going to give them a short trip, but you've met them, you know their bios. You can see them online. But along with myself, and then two other core members of the team who I don't think I've had a chance to introduce. First of all is Eugene Kim. Eugene came to us from the University of Ottawa, which I understand is the best tech law school in Canada.
Correct.
And I'm not trying to pander. And Eugene, prior to working with Sidewalk Labs, where he joined there earlier this year, did privacy and policy work at the Ministry of eHealth Ontario, a stint at the IPC, and he volunteered with Civic and EFF. And then Chelsea Colbert. Chelsea Colbert, who's been with Sidewalk, and I'm surprised I have not introduced Chelsea in the past, because she's been with us for over a year. And she previously was a research assistant for Michael Geist and the late and well-respected Ian Kerr. She also did stints with Civic and has done a ton of research on AI ethics and bringing that to the table. I know that's a lot, but I really want you guys to sort of understand the team that we have behind us and the experience that we are bringing to this project. And so I think it's a helpful context for you understanding how we got here, how we're organized, and how we want to continue to evolve as we move this project forward. So I'm going to now turn it over to Jesse and Jackie, who are going to talk about the appendix work, which they've been working in Mexico. Any questions?
Thanks. No, I'm just going to ask anyone on the phone, please make sure you put it on mute. It sounded like this.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Elisa. And yeah, it's a real honor to be here speaking in front of you all. You know, I know some of you have followed all the discussions that have been taking place here. To reiterate sort of the incredible gratitude we have for the commentary you provided. It is incredibly constructive, and we're really excited for the discussion today and going forward. So one of the things I just wanted to touch on and just sort of reinforce what Christina had already talked about was just a kind of understanding of the overall process here again in terms of the MIDA. You know, we're right now in sort of the kind of evaluation and review of the MIDA itself, or the review and following Waterfront's board vote next month. If that is a positive one, there would be a formal evaluation. I think it's important to highlight here, and this is sort of the planning emphasis, that the next step in this project, if that is to be a positive one, would be initiating a development application. And I think, you know, you all know this very well, but I think Waterfront has a design review panel that is very much involved in sort of the process by which any development applications in Waterfront evolve. And the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel, I think, is presumed to similarly be engaged with any projects as they continue to evolve. So there would certainly be, if this project does advance, many opportunities for continued DSAP review, and I think that participation in an integrated development process where you have real experts that are attending to the issues in any development is something, frankly, that I'm not aware has existed in past projects, and I think is potentially one of the really exciting things that could have come from this. In terms of the actual presentations to date and what we're talking about today, I don't need to review what you've kind of discussed with the teams in the past. The focus today will be, one, this Digital Innovation Appendix, just providing a kind of introduction to that project and a review of the table of contents as that is underway, and inviting kind of questions and feedback on that. And then, as Michael said, having a kind of Q&A around the preliminary commentary that we've shared. And just to kind of come back to the process going forward, again, if this project is to advance into development application, I think it's important to understand what that would actually entail. So that would be the process by which we would then bring on a full design and engineering consultant team, many of whom would also, add additional kind of capacity and specialization around various digital infrastructure elements. It's in that process that we would, continue to be able to address any of the comments that DSAP is providing, as well as Waterfront, as well as the city, and have reviews of that throughout that process. And I think we'll get into this a bit through the appendix work, but one of the things that I think we've already started to recognize, and I think would continue if this project advances, is just, again, how interwoven those things are and how necessary it is for us through this process to actually identify the types of materials that are appropriate for understanding the digital systems that are part of a project, the digital architecture, how you can have a meaningful consultation on that, how you can have a meaningful review and a meaningful evaluation, and how that can work as part of a development application process through stages that go from something like a master plan or schematic design down through construction drawings, if this is, again, to go forward in that way. And so in terms of the Digital Innovation Appendix, what I wanted to highlight is, we've very much heard, this was kind of came through in the preliminary commentary as Charles and all reviewed it today, from Waterfront and from the public, that as kind of Nicole mentioned, that there's a desire for more information and specification about how the digital systems in this proposal might work and how they're related to all other facets of the proposal. And so, we heard that certainly in the commentary, but I'd heard that earlier and are very much for the past months been working to actually be responsive to that, to be able to provide you all with what we hope are the types of materials that at this stage in the project could really be the types of materials that would allow you to have the type of review that we think is necessary and critically important. So that's really what this is in terms of an objective. It's being responsive to that request for more detail and more information and better understanding how it all works together. In terms of a document itself, it will be largely text. There will be some diagrams, a couple of kind of systems architecture sketches. It will certainly be accessible in all the ways that it needs to be. It will be, to be transparent, a couple hundred pages. And I think that's important. You've asked for more information. This is a document designed for an expert community like yourself. In a standard planning and development project, there are always technical documents that are provided for specific professional areas of expertise, whether it's planning, policy, and other areas. This is sort of geared towards you all as a community, and how then any of this type of material would then need to be reflected in what then further consultation takes place upon would be a different exercise. This is directed to you all as a community of experts in this arena. So the overall content, again, Jack will walk through this in great detail, is just sort of a landscape scan and policy overview, really recognizing this project is unfolding in a really kind of existing legal framework in active policy development. It will provide a single comprehensive list, as you've asked from us, of digitally enabled technology that are use cases that are in the proposal, and it will then go into greater detail. And in particular, what we've been really focused on here, and we hope and are confident we will achieve, is that this really responds to your comment around a lot of them might have felt like the what, and there's a question about the how. And we want to be responsive to that and try to provide as much information as we can at this stage about how these things might work and recognize all the complexity involved in that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jackie to give more information on the appendix.
Thanks. Which button?
This one? Yeah, that one, right.
Right one. Okay, thanks. Thanks everyone. It's really a pleasure. Thank you for having us here today. So I think I first want to start by saying this is a draft table of contents, and the specifics of the structure is definitely evolved as we go forward and put forward this work. But we wanted to give you all a preview of what we're putting together, and look forward to getting your reactions and your thoughts. And it's important to also recognize that in putting together the shape of this, we consulted and we referred to all the different, informal as well as formal sources of feedback and inputs, so including Waterfront Toronto's note to reader, the public consultation reports, and of course the interim commentary, as well as the feedback that you had kind of given on the draft, on the MIDIP itself, like as we're going along. And the purpose of this section existing, just to pick up on what Jesse was saying, which is that unlike some of the other appendices that were produced for the MIDIP, for which there was kind of like a pre-existing format that we felt that evaluators were looking for. So specifically, I refer to the policy planning context report that was part of the delivery, and transportation planners have certain types of information that they're looking for as well, which were kind of captured in the mobility appendices. We kind of struggled with thinking about like what's the equivalent of this, and so what we wanted to do here was recognize that this is a rapidly evolving policy area, not just here in Canada but also around the world. And so here we wanted to first kind of help set a frame and kind of contextualize, give an overview of the different challenges and opportunities that arise from digital technologies, as well as give us sampling of the different approaches to addressing them that really informed our proposals in the MIDIP. We focus in particular in this Canadian digital governance landscape on the many aspects of activity that are happening at all levels of government right now, both to kind of give everyone, help you all kind of demonstrate our understanding of the evolving discussions and consultations within which, Quayside and this project will is situated, but also to make it easier for everyone else to kind of understand what that evolving policy landscape is. And then kind of at the end here, we start to, in the kind of lens of holistic urban planning, take a place-oriented approach to looking at how some of these precedents from around the world, as you all know, many of the issues in digital governance are kind of deeply connected and linked, and we thought it would be useful for people to have a sampling of how different places approach tackling some of those challenges. So this is kind of like a section one, which is not specific to the proposal itself, but we hope kind of like helps folks understand what we're talking about. In section 2, which is about privacy regulations, and goes into our proposal for responsible data use, our goal is to really respond to the feedback we've gotten about how urban data as a concept has caused confusion, and that it's not clear how our practices and our practices as a company maps out to the existing privacy regulatory landscape in Canada. So we go over very specifically Canadian policies and laws. We also touch briefly on global precedents as a point of comparison, again, just from this kind of educational context setting perspective. I think what we want to make clear here is that we do, at Sidewalk, believe that government should take the lead. We think that in Toronto, in Ontario, and Canada, there's a real opportunity to be global leaders in inclusive data governance, smart city governance, and we're really excited to be kind of part of that conversation. We're committed to complying to all of the existing policies, and as the different policy initiatives evolve and kind of come to fruition in Canada, we are prepared to comply with what government is going to put forward. So that's kind of like the first part, an urban data trust implementation. This section is really about going deeper into the why of the urban data trust, which is really our hypothesis for how we might enable responsible data use. I think it's important for us to kind of point out that the urban data trust proposal was meant to address a lot of the concerns that we heard around data ownership, privacy, data access, but was not meant to be a replacement for existing laws, which we do say can say in the minute, and this section is really about helping describe how we think this entity, if created, if that's the decision that kind of moves forward, how it would work with existing laws, processes, and structures that are already here. Let's see, RDU guidelines and urban data processes. We also heard from you and as well as all our stakeholders, wanted to know get more detail on how our responsible data use assessment process works, how it's compliant with Canadian law. So here we actually get all the way down into the weeds. And we provide examples along with a template of actually our assessment instrument. We want to be, as a company, transparent and accountable when it comes to privacy. And this section is really about clarifying about how our practices relate to existing laws, how they hold us accountable according to PIPEDA, and help us enable this kind of like this responsible data use vision that we are deeply committed to. And then I think the last section, the summary of commitments and commonly asked questions, we heard that it was not always clear what we committed to as a company versus what is in the MIDIP. So this is again intended to kind of summarize and be a kind of one-stop place where you can see those commitments, and also be a place where we could address some of the commonly asked questions. So let's keep going. There's only 5 sections, so it's not going to go on forever. So section 3 is really about our digital infrastructure proposals. And as this panel knows, there are these 3 key digital infrastructures that we propose, which we believe will be foundational to creating the conditions for urban innovation. So we understand from reading the report, as well as all the feedback from the consultations, that there are a lot of questions around necessity for, feasibility, the benefits of these proposals. And so this section is really about going more into the technical details behind each concept, how these systems work, and how it works with, how we might work with ISPs, for example, around Superpond and enabling that. And then I think actually so also just to respond to Huda's presentation, we'll be presenting here a lot of our research that we've done into distributed credentials that we hope kind of useful to the efforts that you're putting forward. And so as we go about this, we'll be really making an effort to provide the details that all of you are looking for, and have expressed questions around any interim commentary. So section 4, digital systems and data use cases. This is the section where we plan to get a lot more specific on all of the digitally enabled use cases for Quayside. We've pulled together, as Jesse mentioned, and we'll be providing the single list of every digital innovation that's listed in the MIDIP. And then importantly, this is also where we're going to provide examples of how we envision this digital planning process might go forward. We heard loud and clear the desire for more detailed system architecture, sensor locations, and data flows. And while we would like to provide that level of detail to DSAP, it's actually a little too early in the stage where we are in development planning to be able to provide that. So what we're doing in this section is we're going to actually outline the process by which those increasing levels of detail will become clear, how we would document them, and how we would magically provide them in conjunction with the development planning process as that moves forward. And so, for example, we'll have high-level overviews of exactly how these digital innovations would work out in a landscape, and we're also going to pick one example, mobility management, and bring it further through the process so that you can kind of see how, as the development planning process unfolds, you would have increasing visibility into exactly how this will work. So that's the first 2 in programs and prototypes. In that section, we are pulling together in one place the many ways that we sought to support and inclusive communities through our approach to technology development, prototyping, and use cases. So we're actually going to just kind of compile all of the prototyping projects that we've conducted in Toronto, as well as provide an overview of those to inform the design of the neighborhood. So some examples are supporting user testing.
Excuse me, this is Chantal. I don't know about the others, but it is impossible to hear now. Sorry for the interruption.
Jackie, can you actually come and stand in front of the podium? I think it's because of the air vent. It's hitting your microphone intake.
So can you hear me now, Chantal?
Now it is beautiful. Thank you.
Okay. So I was just going through the examples of some of the kind of programs and prototyping efforts we've done here in Toronto. So I mentioned GRIT, but also the co-design work that we did with OCAD around accessibility, and then I think as some of the panel members here know, the work we did around digital transparency in the public realm, which was really about a new way to communicate about digital technologies that exist in the public realm. So I lost my clicker.
Here you go.
So in the last section, which is supporting the growth of the Canadian innovation ecosystem, we're responding to feedback that it wasn't clear how the many elements of the MIDIP work together to enable local innovation. So again, in this section, we are explicitly reaching across the volumes to pull together and clarify how many of the ideas proposed actually would work. So digital infrastructure and open standards, the Urban Data Trust, the Urban Innovation Institute, the Venture Capital Fund could work together to enable the success and the growth of the Canadian innovation ecosystem and help advance the Waterfront Innovation Corridor, which Waterfront Toronto has been developing and progressing across the waterfront for the last few years. We are also going to give some more information on how we think procurement could work, sketching out some broad principles that recognize the different rules that apply to public sector procurement, which I know as personal experience, there are many, and then also private sector procurement. We're also going to address in some more detail our thinking behind the IP proposals in response to some of the questions that we've gotten. And so, like I said, this is really a draft table of contents, and I expect that how we actually structure this and what the final kind of document might look like will change. But yeah, at this point, I just pause for some, any questions or kind of feedback.
There's two things I did want to add that I mentioned up front. In terms of timing, we're planning to deliver this in October, so that's important to understand. And the other thing is, as Christina and George have mentioned, there's an active discussion taking place between Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs around the threshold issues that the board chair Steve Diamond had raised with the release of the draft MIDIP. Many of the topics that this panel has been discussing are part of that discussion. This document will not reflect changes to the proposal. The changes that might come, and we expect there to be changes through this process that we're in with Waterfront Toronto, those would be reflected in what the board would vote upon in October. And then, if that is a vote that is a positive one, those changes would then be communicated to everyone, obviously including yourselves, and would then be the basis upon which your final review would take place. So just to set expectations that this document really is about providing more information, really helping you understand how we have thought about all of these issues as it is informed the MIDIP. It is not the place where we are substantively changing anything about the proposal relative to the comments we've heard from you and many others.
So, at your office on Queens Quay, there's this extraordinarily marvelous model that people can get a sense of, what the community will look like. They can peer into it. It has animations that they can experience and either like or not like what they see from a community standpoint. There's a need in the digital to do something equivalent. I heard you say, we're not at that stage. I can't tell you where all the sensors are, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's also true of the architecture.
Yep.
So I'm going to call bullshit. That I think you need to put something together that gives people a sense of what the experience is going to be. And it might be multiple things, because the experience in public space is going to be very different from the experience potentially in STOA, the experience in a condominium as you're a resident. I mean, there may be multiple scenarios, but you need to give people a sense of what that is, and I think that helps explain, but it also, I think, can help allay fears, and I think it's one of the best ways of informing. So, I mean, Jesse, you know the power of those models because you've helped build them for years, right? So we need to do something in the digital realm that has an equivalent.
Yeah, so I'd love to respond to that. I think when I said we are not going to be able to say every sensor, I meant like every instance of every installation of every sensor. So like that level of detail we're not getting to, but we are taking that integrated list, the list of all the digital use cases, and we are making kind of like representative visuals that will show people kind of how those innovations, those
very,
digital
very
use cases would actually map out like on kind of like a three-dimensional view. So I just want to set expectations that we are absolutely making like an effort to do that, but it won't be, there's 5 of them here, but.
Well, that's also true of the physical architectural models.
Exactly,
I mean, everyone
yeah.
understands that.
Yeah, so we're very much like kind of thinking about
that's good
how architectural models advances and like what's a corresponding level of detail around digital that would kind of match that progression.
Good to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just 2 things. So one, just picking up on what you said, Mark, and I guess I've been a broken record on this since the beginning, but I think from the public, helping them to understand the impact of all these technologies is actually building in some experience design using use cases for them to say that this model exactly is it, to help the public understand what would their experience be with this mix of technologies in this space with their data, both their digital experience and their personal experience might help the public understand the impact of some of these technologies. So a way to model that, I don't know the exact answer, but I think that will be helpful to do. Secondly, I'm a little confused about the role of this document in terms of the steps that you outlined. So we've got this document, which is a response, and I see how it's built on some of what we've said in the commentary and how it's picking up on questions that we've had, at the panel level since the beginning. But we've mentioned from our commentary that we wanted to get a very detailed response to our comments. Would that be like sort of this with that? And how would that work with the work that's being done by Waterfront Toronto around that October 31st deadline? How does that feed into that? And I'm not sure what the role of this document is in that process. Is it just for information for us, or is it something that's determinant for the October 31st deadline, or could it be actually an expression of this reaction that we want, that we've asked for, or this response that we've asked for from the commentary?
So to the latter, I mean, we certainly have expected that this document would be able to include the type of response to the commentary that you've asked for. And that it again has been structured in a way, we didn't know, we just received last Friday the document. We didn't know everything that would be in it, but we assumed that it would likely pick up on many of the themes that you have shared in the past. And so this certainly is expected, and we could, in this time frame, we believe, be able to respond to, much of the commentary. I would leave it to Christina to comment on how this fits into the process with which we are overall underway with Waterfront.
I somewhat see that there's actually 3 pieces of next steps that fall out of where we are today with regards to sidewalk. There would be the Digital Innovation Appendix document, which we've been speaking to them about, which is responsive to both the comments from DSAP, but also in terms of the public consultation and also the feedback that we've given them, which is right in Steve Diamond's letter of there just wasn't enough information for us to be able to make a full evaluation of what's in the MIDP. So that's really a fundamental piece to that. The second piece is a more direct response to the DSAP report, that Sidewalk will have pieces that they'll have to provide, and Waterfront Toronto will have pieces that they'll need to provide as well. And then the third piece is whatever form the outcomes of the discussions we're having with Sidewalk Labs around the broader threshold issues will also be another output that will come through this process as well, and will help to provide additional information before the evaluation. So it's beyond just a both and, it's a both and that will hopefully provide that more fulsome context of of what actually is in play. That helps.
Utah and
Yeah, so to piggyback on Mark's comment regarding what would help clarify what is planned and what to anticipate is a view of the decisions and questions that are to be answered with the data and how those decisions and questions will be answered through the data. So there's a lot of discussion of sensors and monitors and things of that nature. So here are the problems, the decisions, whether automated or not, what data is required to answer those, and how in fact will it be determined what the answer to those questions or decisions are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like we're very much focused on like, you know, this data point, what's the data enabled action in the space that this starts to enable as part of these systems.
Right.
So, yeah, so.
But perhaps putting it into a clearer sort of understanding.
Yeah.
No, that is we very much appreciate that, and I think one of the key things to underscore with the list in that section that Jackie was describing, it really is the list of the things that we have proposed that in the place. It is not the list of things that Sidewalk Lab says that they would be doing in terms of our internal product development.
Yeah, but what you
and
envision.
it works to make those distinctions clear, and also works to make clear who would be decision makers about whether or not to and how those systems would work, who the actors are in this system, because they're different. You know, the actors involved in a pay-as-you-throw system, implementing a public policy in terms of payment in a residential building is distinct from the actors involved in traffic management, as distinct from other things. And so this works, and I think that was a comment that came through in the commentary, was that wasn't clear in the minute for many of you, and I think this is working to try to clarify that.
Just confirming that the appendix will be public, is that right? So it'll come from you to Waterfront Toronto and then you'll post right away, okay?
Correct.
And then, Jacqueline, I'm not sure if I heard you right, under section 5, the procurement principles discussion. Did you say that your appendix will make recommendations about public sector procurement? No, that's not what I said. It's just kind of like sketching out how some of these, some of our procurement principles, like internally for ourselves, but then also express a recognition of how this might unfold in conjunction with existing procurement processes.
Yeah. And to that end, I would just underscore, I think that one of the things that this document is responding to, and I think was included in much of your commentary, was I think there's a perceived lack of acknowledgement on our side of the existing context in which this project is unfolding.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this document is actually a very clear recognition and documentation by ourselves of that existing context. That means these are the public sector procurement principles that apply when there's a public sector actor that would be working in this project. And it is not to recommend changes to that, it is to acknowledge that and to help, to the point of the various actors, help everyone understand where these various kind of principles apply.
So we're not gonna see a third-party new agency to handle procurement?
No.
Okay, I'm that panelist who got grouchy about all
Yeah.
the panelists. There may be others, but that was me, okay.
And to that end, I think partially, and that gets to the data trust and the privacy side and the data governance. I think to underscore, I think we have the impetus for data trust proposal and some of the others was recognizing and trying to document the functions that we think need to be performed. And we are not attached to those entities by any stretch of the imagination. The idea that those functions very well might already be able to be performed is something that we recognize, and that might be how these things come to pass.
Just to build on that, the minute describes sort of a system that has a whole bunch of different components to it, right? And that would be implemented into Quayside and the surrounding area. When you overlay that with the reality of public procurement, and you have this sort of bottom-up, multi-agency, in many cases, potentially multiple levels of government that are going to be at play, does the procurement principles section talk about how you would take this sort of like, and I don't mean monolith in the architectural sense, but just that there's a document that describes a system. How do you take that and apply it into this like diverse, complex procurement regime?
So I don't think we will be able to kind of map literally every single, because it's still again literally every single system. But again, we do make clear in the list of the innovations is the various kind of system owners and sort of where they would fit within various kind of actors, and then you could see that connected to the procurement principles as they are documented here. But I think to your point, the greater degree that we can draw those connections and help people understand, so we're not just abstractly describing procurement principles, but say, and this is how this would matter in this place. You know, this principle would apply in this case. This principle would apply in this case. The more detailed and better understanding people will have about what we're proposing.
If I could jump in that,
Yeah.
Kevin, I'm struggling still, I must admit, a little bit with the timing of these different moving parts. So I guess how fluid is this document? I mean, this feels a little bit like you're giving me an Apple Series Watch 4 when the 5 has already been announced. Because on the one hand, we're getting better information on stuff we've asked from a proposal from a couple of months ago. At the other hand, we hear there's discussion that there may be evolution of that proposal. So how do you envision this evolving as well to reflect the prospect of potential change? I'm not saying there will be, but there might be.
I guess I would say that, you know, and this is to be determined, you know, I defer really to Waterfront Toronto on this in terms of what the expectations would be of what following the board vote in October would be expected of us in terms of the materials to document an evolution of the proposal. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
There's a much broader group of us that are talking through that right now, given the number of issues that are part of that threshold issues list. So I think it's something we'll need to come back to you with, Michael, in terms of a bit of a better scope of what might be released after.
I would say at least we're working with the assumption that if there are changes to the proposal, those would have to be documented and communicated in some fashion. And that would, of course, what that looks like, whether that's an evolution of this document, whether it's an evolution of the what the board would vote upon, that's what's to be determined. But then the idea, to your point, that there's necessarily going to have to be some document that kind of documents what has been voted upon by the board and any changes to the proposal, I think is clear and well understood.
And just to be clear, I think it's really fundamentally important because the term sort of vote with the board, I just want to be clear that the board will only be considering the threshold issues in that October timeframe. There is still a full evaluation of the full proposal that would follow that. So the decision on October 31st is really just whether or not there's been enough alignment that we should proceed to the full evaluation. It's not to enter into contract.
Yeah.
Kevin?
Yes.
Yes, so I just want to tease it a little bit out on the content that you've got in the appendix, because there's a couple fundamental issues that maybe are more broadly around the wider scope of the project, but it does have implications for the digital layer. One is around the geography, the scope, because one of the things that I was unclear of is, you know, what can be done in a Quayside scope versus a Portland scope, and how does that reflect back to what's the art of the possible when it comes to the digital layer? I understand from a LRT and a real estate perspective, but hopefully that's going to be covered somewhere in here as well. And the other one is around, I think it relates to section 5, is that, I mean, there's a strong impetus to make this a very Canadian solution and involve Canadian business and not-for-profit organizations and things of that sort. How are you going to go about making sure what's your collaboration model look like to make sure that that engagement is there? We've seen snippets of it through the process so far, but what's it going to look like going forward to make sure that, you know, we do have that level of engagement from Canadian companies and other Canadian organizations?
To that one specifically, I think that, you know, what this section is focused on is actually exactly to that point, becoming much more clear on what that process of engagement might look like, how, and our strong commitment to that, and then how the various components of the proposal we think contribute to that. But we want to be responsive to that. We think that's critically important, and that's exactly what we would want to see here.
Okay.
I realized in terms of
Yeah, no,
timing,
we're running tight on time.
Yeah, would love to ask y'all some questions.
Let's do that. Let's do that.
So I believe that many of you, I think you should have received from us, and recognizing, we received your report on Friday. We were then able to kind of digest that as quickly as we could, and then put together some questions I think you guys received a couple of days ago. I think we just had a couple of areas. I think what we were hoping here is really, I think, for us to be most effective and really be able to be responsive to Waterfront, to understand sort of what success might look like and how you're sort of thinking about what that might be. And so, in terms of data governance, as Jackie said many times, I think we have no question that the government should lead here. You made that clear in your commentary. That's, I think, something we strongly support. So I guess the question we would ask to you then as advisors to Waterfront, what do you think you will need from Sidewalk on these topics in order to advise Waterfront Toronto on the proposed project and to overcome the information issue that is identified in the letter from their board chair? What do you think you would actually need from us to be able to reasonably address those issues? And again, I think as Michael said, I think obviously these are big questions. If some of you are feel comfortable and confident responding in the moment, that's great. These are just sort of some of the questions we were hoping to have a discussion around. I guess one other one on the data governance side is, do you believe that sort of the regulatory aspects are distinct from the data sharing aspects of the proposal, and then to that degree, sort of how would you think about kind of the data sharing part being advanced, and sort of the and the role that kind of industry and civil society might play in that? So I don't know if anybody has thoughts on those questions.
Can you maybe use? It's always dangerous to use examples because then you get too focused on the example as opposed to the question you're asking. But I feel like it's hard to answer the question like regulatory versus data sharing. It's hard to answer it in the abstract. Like, can you give us an example of the difference?
I guess privacy compliance, or sort of compliance with a responsible data use regime,
versus data sharing around data that might be ostensibly, like under or like affected by those regulatory provisions, right? It's like those are connected issues, like the data you collect and the type of data that it is, versus like how you share it and enable collaboration around it, right, to support innovation.
I don't think we've kicked that idea around, but I think it's an intriguing one to separate the regulatory and the data sharing. In particular, I think you might have a different kind of regulatory regime within this geography, but I've always struggled with the notion of a data sharing regime that's limited to this geography. Right? It just seems too small.
Yeah.
So a data sharing regime that could be much broader than this geography, that brought in a lot of different actors with a lot more kinds of data than you could ever consider collecting in a quayside, could be interesting. Whether it's called a data trust or not, who cares? But you might have, you've got a legal regime, which is fine. That's national and provincial and to some extent municipal. But I think you could also have a regulatory regime that's different for this area, that didn't violate Charter of Rights for people to have their academic freedom and civil collection of data, and then separately have a data sharing thing that covers a much broader geography, perhaps even the whole city, perhaps a larger one than that. I think that's an intriguing concept. I hadn't thought of it before.
Yeah, I'll take a stab but like, to me, the legal one, like, I think this body, Sidewalk, Waterfront can all have opinions about whether or not Canadian privacy law from the 70s is keeping up with the digital economy, right? Like, but I think we can have detailed opinions, but I think at the end of the day, probably want to limit ourselves to having opinions and trying to lobby for change. The second thing is, I think, more of the relevant point, at least for like in the context of this project. And for me, and I come from the private sector, so for me, it's always been about how do you ensure fair multi-party value exchange, right? Like, how do you ensure that if there's value in this data, it's not being disproportionately trapped by whoever gets to write the rules of the architecture?
Yeah, I just wanted to, just want to be clear when we talk about data sharing versus regulatory, that maybe a better way of phrasing this, and I think it's a great question, is how do we modernize current data sharing within regulatory or in addition to, because I think there's a level of advocacy that could occur in terms of modernization of data sharing principles in this specific context, location, geography, in the context of, complying with the regulation, but also informing it in the future. And so in that, I think would be a really valuable conversation, because modernization is always going to be ahead of regulatory regime in many ways, that has to be really conscious of that in its compliance and also in the spirit of the regulation as well.
We have a little time, just like a couple other questions. I think it's actually to pick up on.
Sorry, just to interrupt you, Andrew wanted to say something.
Okay.
He's switching between technologies, so he probably needs a second.
Yes, thanks. Just in response to the more general question about what you'd like, what Sidewalk would like from the panel, I guess I have two comments. One, as you say, for instance, in the letter that you just sent to us, that you've heard many of the comments and questions before. I'm struck by actually how little you've responded to our recurring issues and questions throughout the process in December. So before, I think, getting into these much more difficult and important questions of the difference between governance and sharing, or how to distinguish between them. From my point of view, and I suspect I'm not alone, I would like to see that you've actually taken seriously what we have said so far, and I don't see enough sign of that. We've also said, and maybe it's worth repeating, that many of these questions about governance, which you're trying to address, are things that we and as a panel, but also a much larger set of actors, needs to get involved in before we can properly assess the MIDP. I realize there's a big timing problem about that, but I personally am not really that keen to go through a lot more of what Sidewalk thinks, is a responsible data use process, or specificities of the Urban Data Trust, or the other kind of administrative mechanisms that you plan. That I don't think is really Sidewalk's role, and so I would like to see much more what your ideas about what data you're going to collect, what are you going to do with it, what sort of sharing that you think might be valuable, and make a sort of a case for why that is necessary and beneficial. And then we can talk about what kinds of regulatory mechanisms would be appropriate. But we've got to start, at least from Sidewalk's point of view, I would say, on what is it that you actually have in mind about all this data. And I want to reiterate Mark's comment at the beginning that you can certainly be much more specific, even if you're not being final. So that's my comment.
Yep. Absolutely appreciate your feedback. We are striving for that. And I'd say that, like, in the section around responsible data use, it's really about enabling clarity around how we as a company, as a corporate actor, and this is feedback that we saw, like, in the public consultation very specifically, and then also even in the interim commentary about Sidewalk articulating how we carry these principles forward and how they're applicable to the current regulatory context. So I think that's really just, I'm just going to underline that. 100%.
Move along.
Yeah.
I recognize we're tight on time, so it may be, at this stage, it would be useful if you put kind of the issues and the questions on the table, perhaps all together, and if we have a few minutes to respond, great, and if not, we can try to sort out how we can provide more tools.
Great. I think the other questions we had were, around privacy is sort of a similar one, but is sort of around, what you all think would be sort of sufficient confidence. What does it look like to have sufficient confidence that privacy is being appropriately protected and addressed here, as advice to Waterfront. Around digital infrastructure, I think, I think we have an interest in understanding sort of what are honestly some of the opportunities you see for and precedents you've seen for kind of innovation in infrastructure, whether that's around connectivity, whether that's around how kind of physical systems and digital systems interact, that we should be aware of and can contribute to this project. I think on procurement, I think we'd be really interested. I mean, one of the comments was around this idea of a 50% tech procurement for Canadian companies. I know that was sort of one panelist, but I think that this question of how does one actually think about procurement that fosters local innovation while balancing kind of the need to have best in class as well as sort of really ambitious outcomes, like what might the kind of procurement look like to foster that. I think we're very committed to how this project fosters local innovation, recognize procurement's integral to that. And so a number, should it be through a 50%, and that's that 50% of cost, 50% of revenue, 50% of total contracts, how did that number come to be, or how would you as a panel think about those questions?
And I'd say how that would map out against existing procurement regimes in the public, how does that work? And I envision that working.
And then lastly, on the you recognize that there is public value being brought to this, and so there is a piece of this that is a kind of proposal for sharing and future profit in this case that might come from it. And so you said that this seemed insufficient, and so I guess I'm curious to understand a methodology by which you believe one could actually have an informed evaluation of what would be sufficient. What methodology and what precedents have you seen in terms of being able to evaluate this? Because to our knowledge, there's not a lot of precedents for how to do this, and so we would, I think that's tremendous advice you might be able to provide to Waterfront on how to evaluate what actually is a sufficient public value that is created. Those are the questions.
So there's a lot there. I don't know, and it's challenging to provide immediate responses to all of that.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be in the interest of trying to provide you with like a real response that's reflective of some of the kinds of views that we take this on board and think about a way to try to respond to. I'm open to other panelists.
We have a report writing committee, so maybe we could undertake to collate a response from the individual panelists into something that's a coherent response back. Does that make sense, Charles?
Yep.
I'm certainly willing to help out with that.
Yes, great. I think it's better than us sort of winging the answer, right? And also it would be more representative of the entire panel.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that would be super helpful for us.
Yeah, we absolutely.
And since I'm the obvious source of the 50%, I'm happy to have a discussion with you about that.
Great.
All right, well, thank you for your time.
Okay, all right, in that case, thank you.
Not sure if you can international. Well, we do it for.
Okay, I think I need a motion
We do
to,
it for
thank you
defense.
for that. I think I need a motion to move into closed session. So if we can get a motion to go back into open session, we have to do that and then vote. Okay, thank you. If there is anyone there, just let me discuss that. There is not. Can I get a motion to adjourn?